Hold still.
The high tone
Stop
came from a
resisting.
battered unit set on a folding table between
Get him
cots.
against the wall.
People were talking when the sound started. Jonah stopped mid-sentence and his hand dropped from the paper cup. Suspicion tightened in the control recording before any formal directive. The tone did not belong in normal broadcast bands. Station operator Nexus foremarked that suspicion with a slow, careful intake of breath and sent a ping to field teams. The gym filled with sudden silence that did not come from a lack of air, but from bodies gone motionless. Elias Park pushed himself forward through the nearest cluster of cots and found Jonas' eyes open and unblinking. Elias' throat worked. He swallowed and pulled the child's chin back to check a pulse. The heartbeat was present but shallow, like a faulty metronome. Elias felt suspicion turn into urgency. He slapped Jonas' shoulder twice, hard enough to leave a red impression. "Jonah, come on, Elias," and the syllables felt wrong in the sudden quiet. A volunteer Mara shouted for medics. Voices broke the stillness, but the fixed faces did not respond. Nexus Force Log would later record 2 decisions during those first seconds. Initiate local emergency flagging and open an exclusion channel. The operator's hands tapped the console while technicians argued over secure isolation. Suspicion governed Nexus Force movement. Every input was designed to test whether this was an electrical fault or something transmissible. The records show a mental shift from curiosity to concern, and then to procedural escalation, and that shift determined the first orders sent to the shelter. Elias found a volunteer trying to pry a cheap radio from the hands of a woman who had gone rigid. "Mara, give me the radio," he said. Mara's fingers trembled as she handed it over. Elias turned the dial and heard the tone, thin, sustained, and pitched so high the edges bit his teeth. He felt a pressure behind his eyes and stepped back. Elias' reaction changed from protective impulse to self-preservation. He cupped Jonas' face with both hands, blocking his ear, and called for someone to cover their own heads with jackets. The jacket fabric scraped, a specific, grounding noise. Someone banged on the annex door. Field medic Ramirez pushed in with a satchel and 2 adrenaline kits. He scanned faces, then set a hand where he could feel breathing. "Ramirez, Elias." Ramirez did not look surprised. The medic's face folded into the slow efficiency of triage. "We have several unresponsive, Ramirez," and his voice carried a procedural detachment. That detachment clashed with Elias' rawness and pushed Elias to act faster. He opened his notebook and thumbed to a page of crude waveforms he had been tracing earlier. His handwriting trembled into jagged ticks. He tapped a line of repeating micro-patterns and said, "This matches what I've been hearing, listen." The notebook gave the medic something concrete to hold. Maya, the social worker, took the notebook and read aloud the waveform description. Her voice hit the syllables carefully. "There's rhythm here, Maya," it repeats with a lullaby interval. The words landed like a new fact. Elias' anxiety shifted toward a sharp, focused dread. He remembered a lullaby his mother hummed years ago, and that memory became a tool. He could name what the pattern resembled and pass that to the technicians. The recognition altered the team's response. Suspicion had become hypothesis. Hypothesis required testing. At broadcast control, Nexus 4 picked up the same tone on a fragmented emergency channel 20, 7 seconds after the shelter recording began. The operator's fingers found the intercom and keyed a terse alert to Technician Lyle. "And Commander Briggs, we have a localized frequency anomaly at Shelter 7, Nexus 4 said. Initiate containment protocol beta. Evacuate non-critical staff from the vicinity and seal the intake vents." Lyle's answer was sharp. "Beta cuts traffic, but it also kills comms. We lose reach if we hard isolate." Briggs pushed back, voice low and impatient. "We lose more if we leave it spreading." Nexus 4 authorize a partial quarantine now. The argument lasted 38 seconds on record and contained a quick exchange of 3 to 5 clustered lines where orders met objections. "Lyle, you triangulate with the van now." Briggs, Nexus 4 wants quarantine. "I want the van to pinpoint source," Lyle replied. "We can triangulate with a collapsing net." "Commander," Nexus 4 interjected, calm and precise. "Quarantine first. We can risk a trace if exposure is contained." The back and forth ended with Briggs scowling and relenting. The decision placed containment above curiosity, and that decision would shape the next hour. Back at the shelter, Elias watched Ramirez and Maya organize a makeshift clinic in the annex. They moved with hands that knew routines. Ramirez inserted an airway and checked pupils while Maya recorded names and symptoms on a clipboard. Elias handed the notebook to Ramirez and said, "The waveform repeats in a lullaby timing, 3 notes. Then a gap." Ramirez read the waveform notes and nodded. "If it's S-patterned. It's deliberate, Ramirez. If it's deliberate, someone is directing it, or someone is compelled to reproduce it." Elias's voice grew thin. "Or it's mimicking something we've lost." That line landed without flourish. It simply connected cause and effect for the team. Technician Lyle deployed a mobile signal van into the shelter parking lot under halogen lights. The van's antenna hummed as engines idled. Lyle set up a recorder and plugged into the shelter feed. He called the control room with a dry voice. "I can get a read, but I've got interference spikes when people move toward the corridor nexus." Force response was to order a network quarantine and to authorize recording every mimicry vocalization for later analysis. The control room's orders came as low, clipped sentences, and they sounded like commands because they carried the weight of the national protocol. Elias moved between cots, speaking names. "Jonna, blink for me." He touched Jonna's wrist and felt the tremor that came with shallow breathing. Somewhere down the line, another patient, an older man, began to murmur. His lips formed shapes that did not become words at first, until a clear tone slipped out and the corridor stilled again. The staff froze. One by one, a mimicry line echoed, and where the tone touched people, their muscles slackened. Elias lunged for the man and clamped a hand over the mouth, pressing until the tone ceased. The man sagged and then gasped. Elias' body moved from observation to direct physical suppression. His hands smelled of sweat and disinfectant. Nexus, force log recorded a new priority. Capture the mimic's audio before it could spread. Lyle's van recorded a clean sample that night and later displayed an anomalous micro pattern that matched Elias' notebook, a rising interval, a lullaby fragment, and a silent space that felt measured. Maya hummed the fragment to herself while writing, and the hum carried through the shelter like a thread. That humming was a small, private thing that would later prove dangerous. At one point, a quarantined resident, Mr. Santos, attempted to rise and walk the corridor while murmuring the tone. He did not recognize his own motion. His eyes were open and placid. Ramirez intercepted him with a physical hold and shouted, "Stop, Santos!" The shout broke something in Santos for a fraction of a second. His shoulders seized and the tone collapsed. Elias helped pin Santos to a floor mat. "We need the audio, Elias. If someone can reproduce it with their voice, we can record it and analyze the pattern." Ramirez tied a strap. Maya secured Santos' wrists with Velcro. The concrete actions, hands, straps, recorded clips, moved the story forward in a way that words alone could not. Nexus 4 requested an encrypted trace from Lyle. The technician's reply came with static, trace in progress, getting a wobble at the subcarrier level, not a tower. Not a known transmitter. Nexus 4 wrote the phrase embedded pattern into the log and replayed the shelter clip. Elias leaned in at the annex table and pointed to the notebook. "That lullaby matches the way Jonah hums when he falls asleep. Elias, it's not just notes. It's the timing he uses." He heard it once at home. Maya's face went still. She repeated the syllables of the lullaby and then stopped pale. "Where did Jonah hear that?" she asked. Elias answered with a short sentence. From an old cassette his mother left in the house. That disclosure changed the assignment of suspicion. The idea that the tone contained a child's lullaby fragment shifted the group's emotional trajectory. What had been an unknown hazard now carried a painful human reference. Lyle argued that the input could be accidental. Nexus 4 wanted to treat it as intentional. Commander Briggs insisted on strict quarantine around objects. "Bag everything that's loose," Briggs ordered, and Vargas, a logistics tech, began sealing boxes of personal items. The order produced immediate activity. Bags rustled, doors shut, and the shelter filled with the sharp sound of tape. The mimicry attack became the chapter's peak when the quarantined resident, previously placid, began to reproduce the tone in the corridor with an audible clarity that pierced the shelter. The tone's first pass took 2 staff members. Their knees buckled, and they slid to the floor like marionettes cut loose. Ramirez lunged and grabbed the resident's jaw to stop the second pass. Elias pushed past, blocking his own ears with the padded hood of his sweatshirt as a makeshift muffler. That moment compressed panic into a handful of actions. Hands closing on throats, a strap cinched, a radio smashed into the corridor to break the frequency. The attempts worked for some and failed for others. A mid-chapter cliffhanger arrived in the form of a sudden loss of comms between the van and control. Lyle's voice went thin and clipped, and then fell away. Nexus 4 tried re-establishing connection and opened a backup frequency. Nothing returned. For 42 seconds, the control room and field van had no shared data. The silence forced a split-second decision record. Authorize autonomous extraction of the van or instruct it to hold position and risk further exposure. Briggs barked an order, hold position. Record everything locally. Do not transmit that command left the van isolated and left field teams without external guidance. Elias felt exposed in a new way. The shelter's noise had become the only map. The trace eventually returned with an anomalous waveform superimposed on the shelter audio. Analysts in the control room flagged an embedded carrier beneath human hearing. Lyle scribbled notes that placed the carrier outside normal allocations. The carrier's pattern matched the Lullaby micro interval. Nexus 4 authorized a truncated containment bulletin that ordered local evacuation and advised public health units to prepare for neuro-auditory events. The bulletin used plain sentences, minimal adjectives, and avoided metaphor, do not follow the sound. Cover ears and move to sealed compartments. Record any vocal mimicry and report it as contaminated audio, the operator's message said. Elias stood by a window and watched a busload of evacuees climb aboard under yellow lights. The city smelled of diesel and wet pavement. He checked Jonah's pulse again. Jonah blinked and mouthed nothing. Maya came up behind Elias and touched his shoulder. We held them for now, Maya, and her voice cracked once. Elias put the notebook back into his hoodie and folded his fingers over the spine. He felt the last emotional shift of the chapter there, an uneasy containment that tasted like temporary success and a warning. Relief and dread lived in the same place. The team had bought time, not answers. Nexus 4 closed the corrupted log with a formal evacuation directive and an instruction to seal the shelter's audio bank. The operator spoke slowly into the record. This file will be archived. Personnel exposed to the signal must remain under observation for 48 hours. The signal appears to imprint a repeating micro, pattern shared with human lullaby intervals. The voice carried no flourish. It catalogued facts and issued a procedure. The feed then fractured into static. In the final recorded frame, Maya hummed the lullaby fragment under her breath while cataloging patient names. The hum lasted 3 bars, off rhythm, and then stopped when a tape recorder clicked and the log sealed. The chapter ends with a concrete beat. Vargas carried a sealed evidence bag to the transport van and handed it to Lyle. Lyle took the bag and locked it in the van's trunk. The van's rear doors closed. The van's engine started. Nexus 4 watched the screens until the signal faded, then authored a short note to Central. Monitor frequency. Stand by for further instructions. The operator's final action was to press the archive key and watch the waveform freeze on screen. The freeze was not poetic. It was an administrative movement that closed the incident for now. Emotion route. Suspicion guided every early decision. The chapter shows at least 2 clear emotion shifts: suspicion to urgency to methodical dread, and then to cautious containment. Those shifts appear through actions, orders, hands, recordings, and dialogue. Nexus Forcecom commands, Briggs's terse objections, Lila's technical cautions, Elias' blunt pleas. The events are concrete and sequential: a tone, a mimicry, a failed trace, a quarantine, and a sealed log. The ending leaves an aftertaste of unease. A lullaby fragment persists in a survivor's humming and in an encrypted audio file that technicians will study. The evacuation notice hangs on a printed sheet pinned to the control room wall as the static settles, and a locked van drives away with the recorded sample in its trunk. The test tone hit the temporary medical bay while Jonah dialed the unit's calibration knob. A dresser drawer rattled. A man on a cot sat upright and froze mid-breath. Elias Park shoved a tray away with both hands and mouthed a single word into the half, light. A tone, fear tightened the back of his throat and pushed his fingers to his notebook. Elias had been awake for hours. He was not the lead technician. He was a survivor in a room meant to hold survivors. He had a notebook filled with wave sketches and a plastic wristband still looped on his skin from intake. He kept scanning the unit because of what had happened earlier. The high tone that Jonah and others traced weeks before to a battered unit between cots. That earlier event sat like an instruction in Elias's head: do not ignore the sound. The problem was concrete. The frequency caused people to collapse into rigid, vacant states. That was the conflict. They could not treat this as an electrical fault. Jonah's hand slammed the AM's top. He cursed. Jonah always cursed when the gear misbehaved. Field medic Ramos lunged for the patient and found the body unresponsive but breathing in shallow, regular pulls. Ramos checked pupils, then pinched a knuckle. He wanted to come back. Ramos' voice clipped. Jonah's eyes were fixed on the AM unit. Elias watched Jonah's fingers tremble and the way Jonah's jaw worked when he tried to say a plan. Leave him. Jonah, move people to the center. Pull the units away. Now the command had Jonah's name on it. The others moved without asking. Shelter Supervisor Green grabbed an IV pole and dragged a cot as if clearing lanes. Pastor Marta Liu came through the doorway with a small satchel of himam cards and a wet handkerchief. She set the cards on a tray and left her hands visible. Elias rubbed his own throat in the same motion he had drawn the tone in his notebook hours earlier. He could not stop thinking about the battered AM from the previous file, the one that had caused Jonah and his colleagues to mark a spectral center outside known bands. He did not trust equipment now. He trusted small human checks, a breath, a blink, the way someone tried to answer. That distrust shifted him into action. He walked straight to the table where the AM unit sat and crouched low. Elias, Don T. Ramos began. Elias cut him off with a short, sharp motion. I'll cut power. Give me a minute. He unhooked the microcassette recorder that hung from his jacket pocket and set it on the table to record what he would do. He wanted a trace. He wanted proof. Jonah kept his eyes on Elias like a man watching a fuse. Jonah hissed through teeth, do not touch the main feed until we isolate the neighbor circuits. He pulled a roll of electric tape from his pocket and handed it to Green. Jonah's voice dropped to a thin directive, well practiced. No radios, no phones. We block the ward doors. Dialogue drove the room. Jonah, the control line is fried. Green. He raised a hand to point at exposed wiring. It jumps back when I try to ground it, Jonah barked back. 3 short lines of quick planning. Cut the feed to the AM first. Cut the power at the panel. Ramos, watch the corridor. Elias, cover the line with tape. If the tone restarts, get everyone outside. No exceptions. The exchange was rapid, short sentences. Jonah's cadence was mechanical. Ramos' replies were muscle memory. Elias knelt and followed Jonah's order like a ritual. He slid his fingers along the AM's battered casing. The unit was colder than he expected. He found the ground and slid a taped clamp over the feed. He moved slowly because his hands trembled. He felt the same fret he had when Jonah earlier stopped mid-sentence in the memory Elias had kept. A man whose hand dropped from a paper cup because sound took that man from him. That memory made Elias hesitate before cutting. Jonah watched him and said, now. Elias tore the feed. The tone broke into a high keening that stung the back of his ears and made him taste metal. The frozen man on the cot inhaled and his limbs dropped in a small collapse. Ramos rolled him onto his side and checked airway. Elias took 3 hard breaths and said nothing. They got immediate, practical results. The ward did not clear of risk. The tone left traces. A smear across paper singed edges on a hymn card and a thin circular mark in the dust beneath the AM. Elias photographed the mark with an old phone. He kept a running list in his head of what to do next. Fear had widened into focused urgency. They moved fast. Jonah, Elias, Ramos, Green, and Pastor Marta set up a makeshift analysis station with a folding table, a laptop Jonah had hacked to act as spectrum analyzer, and Elias' notebook. Jonah hooked a directional microphone and pointed it at the corridor where the AM had sat. "We need a sweep." Jonah traced the spectral center and locked the band. He spoke like a technician ordering tools. Pastor Marta closed his eyes and touched the hymn cards. "Marta, Jonah, let me listen." "I only need one card." Jonah's eyes narrowed. He was a technician first, no pastor. "We need technical traces, not ritual." Marta cut him off. "When Jonah and I listened to the same sample yesterday, I recognized cadence. Give me one hearing. If it matches, it tells us where it came from." Elias watched Jonah's jaw tighten and then loosen. Jonah set the analyzer to a narrow band and played the recording of the tone they had captured in the other incident, the one from the battered unit between cots. Pastor Marta leaned forward. Her fingers hovered above the cards. She recognized a pattern and said, "Stop. That cadence, it's a broken hymn from Old Canton. They're repatching a fifth above an old prayer. They used it like a marker. That revelation shifted the group's framing." Jonah's thinking narrowed to frequency. Marta's thinking expanded to culture and ritual. Elias felt the second emotion shift in him. Focused terror moved toward a cold, determined curiosity. He tapped his notebook and showed Jonah the sketch that matched the cadence Marta named. Jonah blinked at the matching waveform. "So it's not purely electrical." "Jonah, someone used the band. Or something used it using human tech." Green frowned and asked, "Who uses hymns in a frequency like that?" Marta answered, "A group that overlays old melodies onto carrier tones. They wanted attention or they wanted a label." A new problem arrived then. A quarantined subject in the corridor began to imitate the cadence. They heard it as a ragged whistling between breaths. Elias looked up and saw the man's mouth shape the same pattern. He singing, Ramos stepping forward. The man pressed his palms against the ward wall and began to repeat the tone with his throat like a forced hum. The imitation terminated in a cough that cracked his jaw. He lurched. Green and Ramos moved together to restrain him. "Get back!" Green shouted. He pushed the man down. The man screamed in a raw voice that matched the waveform and then went limp. "Jonah, sever the source. Cut the channel." Now they argued for 20 frenetic seconds. "Jonah, if it spreads by mimicry, we isolate sound. We seal every doorway and cut any device that can carry that carrier." "Marta, you can just cut them out. People will panic and run into each other. You need an anchor, something to hold them steady." The argument contained 5 rapid exchanges. Jonah, Marta, Grimos, Elias. Each line was a short instruction or objection. The room's decisions split. Elias felt the third emotion shift then. The initial fear and curiosity crystallized into a hard responsibility. He stepped between Jonah and Marta when Jonah moved to pull the radio racks. "We do both." Elias, trace the band and keep people calm. Jonah, run the sweep. Marta, stay with the corridor. Green, help me with the patients. Ramos, watch the exits. The order came from him, not from title. The team accepted it. They worked in a strict sequence. Jonah ran spectral traces and watched a spike at a narrow hertz. Elias traced the same spike with his notebook's crude sketches. Marta hummed low phrases to some of the dazed patients until their eyes slowed, as if the human voice kept them tethered. Green and Ramos physically carried 2 collapsed people into a cleared corridor where they could check airways and vitals. Jonah reported center at 800.9 kHz with a harmonic cluster at 5.2 kHz. He spoke numbers like a man reading coordinates. Elias wrote them down and then added a different note. The harmonic cluster matched the broken hymn Marta identified. Elias allowed, "If that's right, the sound carries a pattern meaningful to human brains because it's a patchwork of music and carrier. It isn't T-random. It's coded." Marta looked at Elias hard. Whoever used it wants recognition or control. They debated containment measures. Jonah wanted a remote counter frequency to disrupt the carrier. Green wanted immediate evacuation. Marta wanted a quieter ritual intervention to anchor people. Ramos wanted to treat the patients and wait for higher authority. Nexus 4's voice entered the room over the control console at that moment, thin and mechanical. Containment protocol update. Initiating counter burst sequence in 10 seconds. Stay clear of the broadcast hub. The voice was the station operator identifier. Nexus 4, procedural and flat. Jonah cursed under his breath. He had not authorized anything. He scanned the console and saw the operator's command loop being injected despite their isolation. Nexus 4, hold. Jonah shouted into the headset. The operator's voice stuttered and then returned half corrupted. Encounter burst, do not evacuate. The transmission fragmented into a clipped stream of syllables and static. Elias' stomach dropped. The corrupted directive forced immediate improvisation. Jonah motioned at Elias, cut the AM physically. Cut it now. If Nexus 4 is trying a counter burst without coordination, it could interact with the harmonic and worsen this. Elias reached for the AM unit again. He had learned its weight, its dense, the way the casing creaked. His hands were steadier now because his fear had been turned into focus. He found the power lug, wrapped a tape around it, and began to pull. Jonah stood by ready with gloves. Ramos moved with green to block anyone from entering the broadcast hub. They executed the move like a practiced drill. Jonah pulled a steel bar and pried at a mount while Elias dragged the unit off the table, and Jonah severed the cable with a bolt cutter. The sound that issued as they separated connectors was a thin, rising scream that glued itself to the room. The corridor lights flashed. Marta's HIM card slid off the tray. When the feed broke, the reaction was immediate and worse than anyone expected. The broken frequency and the operator's partial counter burst met in the air and formed a compound waveform that rippled through every exposed throat. Several patients seized. One man thrashed and cracked his teeth on a feeding tube. Jonah's face went pale. He shouted down! Get them down! Green and Ramos dove for bodies and slammed them to the floor, pinning arms and legs. Elias threw his weight into a shoulder to stop a convulsion from slamming into a metal cabinet. The climax arrived where the outline had promised. The countermeasure backfired. The chapter's most intense moment carried the highest stakes. It was also the smallest, rawest detail that changed everything. Jonah, having pried the AM unit from its table, realized his bolt cutter had nicked a microcoil in the unit's chassis. The nick acted like a new conductor and allowed the counter burst to fold into a harmonic they had not calculated. Jonah's hands shook as he looked at the exposed coil. He turned to the console to shut down the operator feed, but the control line was hot with signal. Elias heard Nexus 4's voice again, this time closer from the room's backup speaker. The operator said, "Archive log, counter, frequency initiated. Unintended resonances detected. Recommendation, seal perimeters and extend evacuation radius to 2 units. Repeat. Extend evacuation." The voice dipped into static and returned with a clipped phrase. Containment breach, HIM signature. Then the feed died. The operator's last words left them with a single directive fragment. Ramos knelt over a convulsing woman and held her jaw, murmuring, "Stay with me, stay with me." Green shouted to a nurse in the corridor, "Bring saline." Jonah grabbed Elias by the shoulder. "Elias, the notebook, where's the waveform match?" Jonah's voice was thin with exhaustion. Elias thrust the notebook into Jonah's hands. "They're drawn from the first sample. The harmonic matches Marta's HIM. If we sever the carrier, the mimicry should stop. But the counter burst folded into the harmonic. We can just blast more sound without knowing the phase." Elias' words were rapid now. He felt an urge to say more, to make precise steps. That need for precise action was a form of control. Pastor Marta knelt beside a dazed young man and laid a HIM card on his palm. "Listen to the words," she said. Her voice was steady. "If you hear me, hum after me. Do you hear me?" He nodded thinly. Elias watched Marta's hands. Her method worked in small pockets. Her hum kept 2 people from seizing fully. Her human voice regained control where equipment had failed. They evacuated the incapacitated down a cleared corridor. The power flickered. The broadcast loops collapsed in a stuttering way. Someone in the back screamed when a door latched shut and did not open. Elias kept his attention on small, changeable details. Singed paper corners, smell of ozone, and on the way Jonah's fingers found his face and rubbed at a thin seam of sweat. Those were the concrete items that told him what to do next. After the immediate collapse, the survivors moved into the evacuation corridor and set down the incapacitated on blankets. Elias and Ramos checked pulses and set IVs. Green secured doors and logged names. Jonah disappeared into the control hub to attempt repairs. Marta gathered hymn cards and handed them out to anyone coherent enough to hum. Each action was practical. Each action moved them away from helplessness. Elias found a cluster of singed paper and thin ritual marks in the dust near the am's former position. The marks were small circles pierced with short strokes, burned into the laminate like somebody had pressed a compass point and dragged it. He photographed them. He picked up a loose scrap of paper with words half burned, a name and a date. The words aloud, slow. Old Canton, third verse, do not break the calling. He had a voice then, calm and clear. Green read over Elias's shoulder. They left a calling. They used ritual markings in the room. This was set up here. Not accidental, Elias forced himself to replay the earlier memory, the am between cots from the previous file, without letting it become an abstract ghost. He remembered Jonah stopping mid-sentence, the hand dropping from the paper cup. He remembered the precise sound that had taken Jonah's neighbor. That memory became a data point. He took the notebook out and traced the waveform until Marta interrupted. Listen, Marta, the pattern isn't just hymn fragments. They've embedded the name of a chapel into it. Whoever made this wants to tie place and sound. Elias felt a twist in his chest. He had moved through stages, fear-focused curiosity, responsibility, and now a deeper dread. He had to decide what to do with the information. Jonah entered and dropped into a chair. He had black at the corners of his eyes. Nexus 4 recorded an archival log before the feed lost integrity. It recommended extended monitoring and a narrow evacuation protocol. But that log was corrupted. Parts of it suggest someone intentionally overlaid cultural patterns onto carrier waves. Elias read the console's corrupted log with Jonah. The operator's voice had written phrases in clipped syntax. Resonance matches hymn patch. Recommend quarantine perimeter. 2 cells. Note. Ritual mark detected near source. Monitor for mimicry spread. The log then ended in static and 3 repeated syllables that looked like a code. 737, they compared notes. Green, 737, case file 7, they had to choose. Jonah argued for a technical lockdown and immediate isolation protocols. Marta argued for outreach to cultural authorities who knew old Canton prayers. Green argued for moving the remaining people to an outdoor staging area. Elias looked around at the team and at the patients. He thought of the man who had landed rigid from the first tone and of the small ritual markings and singed hymn cards. He stood and gave a single decision. We do containment and cultural outreach together. Green, secure the perimeter and get the ambulances ready. Jonah, extract the corrupted log and store it offline. Ramos, triage and list those showing mimicry. Marta, I need you to catalog every hymn variant you recognize. We will trace origin while we evacuate. The team moved. They worked in short, efficient bursts. Jonah pried open the console, pulled a hard drive, and wrapped it in a foil-lined bag. Ramos labeled patients. Green radioed an external transport. Marta hummed and taught a chorus to a small group to keep them grounded during transfer. Elias pocketed his notebook and the phone with photographs and took the ritual scrap in a sealed envelope. They left the control room with a new protocol in hand and a trail of concrete tasks. Elias felt exhaustion, but also clarity. The emotional arc had moved from raw fear to duty, and then to grim, steady focus. He had choices to make, and he made them. The immediate cliffhanger came when Jonah stopped at the threshold and said, "If anyone else hears that cadence on a broadcast, do not respond to operator directives until we verify." The statement implied that the operator itself might be compromised. The group acknowledged the risk without dramatizing it. Outside, in the evacuation corridor, the night air felt cooler. The generator hummed in a low tone. Patients lay on stretchers and sighed. Marta paced between them, humming under her breath. Green scribbled names. Ramos checked IVs in sequence. Elias sat for a moment on an overturned crate and opened his notebook to draw the composite waveform. He sketched the hymn overlay and then, against the habit of tidy notes, wrote a single line. A trace origin Old Canton Chapel, third verse, he circled it twice. Jonah came and sat across from him. You did good, Jonah. He did not say it like a compliment, he it like a report. Jonah's voice sounded older now, fraying at the edges. Nexus, force log showed another directive that didn't he finish. It was going to recommend containment, but it kept returning the word evacuate, then monitor, then do not tune out. We can trust a fragmented voice. Elias nodded. He felt the final emotional shift. The raw fear had become procedural acceptance. He accepted the work before him. He understood how the tone acted, as a transmitter of cultural hooks that made people mimic and then collapse. He knew what to file in his notebook and what to hand over to Marta and Jonah. Before they left, Elias walked back into the control room. He needed to make one entry into the archival log. Nexus 4 had left a partial recommendation and a corrupted phrase. Extend evacuation, 2 units. Elias perched at the terminal and methodically typed a formal log entry that he imagined the operator would record if it were whole. He wrote facts. Device removed, counter, burst attempted, unintended resonances created, ritual marks present, hymn cadence matched Old Canton third verse, evacuation initiated, suspects. Unknown transmitter source. He attached photos and the waveform sketch. He hit save. The file tagged itself into the archive. Jonah stood behind him and put a hand on his shoulder. We send this up the chain, Jonah. We ask for experts on cultural signal overlays, and we keep the site sealed. We name the source as probable ritualized transmission until proven otherwise. Elias closed the terminal and felt a cold, precise thing settle. Completion of that chapter's work. He had traced the tone to its ritual mark, catalogued the harmonic, and enforced a containment plan that combined technical and human measures. He had held the team together through the countermeasure failure and the immediate collapse. The small ritual traces remained. Singed paper, circles in dust, and a scrap of half-burned words. He put the scrap into a sealed envelope and folded the hymn card into the folder labeled Evidence. They left the facility in a convoy organized by Green. Jonah rode with the hard drive. Marta rode with the patients who needed humming. Ramos and Elias rode with the ambulances that would take the most unstable to a higher care facility. Nexus, Force final archival log replayed once more on the portable recorder Elias had left running, looping a corrupted instruction followed by a low drone. The recorder clicked off when the batteries failed. At the staging area, Elias stepped out of the ambulance and paused. He looked back at the sealed wing and the darkened windows. He had no answers about who had overlaid a hymn onto a carrier and why. He did have a path forward. Trace the hymn to Old Canton, consult cultural experts, and keep broadcasts isolated until verified. He had the evidence and the team that knew the steps. Elias put his hand over his notebook and felt the ridged edges of his pen. He felt the fatigue along the bones of his forearms and the steady ache behind his eyes. He took a single breath and then walked toward the command tent to file the final provisional log. Jonah called his name and Elias turned. Elias, Jonah, we lock this as case file 7. You and I will follow the waveform. Marta will contact a cultural liaison. Green will run perimeter. Ramos will take patient lists. Record everything. Elias answered. I will trace the hymn to its source. I will start with Old Canton references. I'll not skip steps. His voice was flat, precise. They moved with purpose. The team's roles were defined by action and the evidence they had collected. The chapter closed on a concrete beat. Elias zipped the envelope labeled Ritual Evidence into his satchel and stepped toward the vehicle that would take him to the archive terminal. The red light of an emergency emblem flickering above the tent as power looped into a low, steady drone. The emblem blinked once and then entered a slow, looping static pulse as the broadcast feed collapsed into the final corrupted directive.